In the flickering torchlight of 16th century Russia, the Tsardom stood perched on a knife's edge. One moment of fury was all it took to send the empire tumbling into madness. This is not just the story of a father and a son. It's the tale of a dynasty torn apart by paranoia, blood, and grief. Ivan Ivanovich was meant to be the future. Instead, his death became the curse that poisoned the Romanov legacy long before it began. This isn't folklore. This truly happened. And the echoes of that one deadly blow still haunt Russia's history. The snow never stopped falling in Moscow. It drifted over the roofs of the Kremlin like dust on a tomb. Inside those thick red walls lived a man who ruled with fire and iron. Ivan IV, known to all as Ivan the Terrible, had been crowned with the title of Tsar as a boy. He was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he was alone. Ivan had known betrayal from his earliest memories. His mother had been poisoned. His boyhood was filled with cold palaces and colder advisors. When he finally grasped power, he clutched it so tightly, he squeezed the life out of anything near it. But there was one thing he loved. One person he cherished above all else. His son, Ivan Ivanovich. The boy was everything that Tsar had prayed for. Handsome, sharp, obedient, loyal. Raised under the eyes of tutors and monks, the young prince learned to speak Latin and Greek. He studied war. He memorized the Bible. But what made his father proud was the boy's strength. In battle, Ivan Ivanovich rode like a warrior. He led troops. He made judgments. He looked like the next ruler of all Russia. People said he was golden, the golden heir of a dark and dangerous king. But the older the Tsar grew, the more his mind slipped into shadows. He heard whispers in every corridor. He saw plots in the faces of his generals. He beat his wives. He killed trusted men. And still the boy stood beside him. Still, the boy believed. Then came the day the boy crossed him. It started with a dress, or rather, the lack of one. Ivan Ivanovich's pregnant wife wore clothing the Tsar found improper. He saw it as a sign of shame, of rebellion. He flew into a rage. He struck her so hard she lost the child. The boy snapped. He turned on his father, screaming, accusing. How dare the Tsar harm his family? What right did a man have to kill his own blood? That was all it took. The Tsar's eyes turned black. His hand gripped the heavy staff he always carried, and before anyone could stop him, he brought it down on his son's head. There was a sound like a melon splitting. The boy fell. Blood poured from his temple. The Tsar dropped the staff. He ran to the body. He wept. He begged. He howled like a wounded beast. He pressed his lips to the wound, praying to seal it with love. But it was too late. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. The Cathedral of the Archangel stood still as stone. It was meant to echo with the songs of succession, the bells of joy. Instead, it was drowning in silence. The body of Ivan Ivanovich, the heir to the throne, lay under its vaulted arches, stretched out in royal robes. But there was no crown on his head. No father stood by his side. Just shadows, candles, and fear. Ivan the Terrible didn't speak for days. Those who dared to approach him found a man broken. His eyes were red, his beard tangled. He would rock back and forth, whispering to no one. Sometimes he struck himself. Other times he struck the walls. Once he screamed at his own reflection. He asked it why it had killed his son. There was no answer. Russia was in mourning, but not just for the boy. They were mourning for the future. Ivan Ivanovich had been the glue holding the court together. He had calmed his father's storms. He had earned the respect of the nobles. He had made enemies think twice. Now he was gone. The Tsar had other sons, but none like the dead prince. His youngest, Dmitri, was just a child. Too young to rule, too soft to survive. And then there was Fyodor, the middle son. Quiet, simple. Some said he was gentle. Others said he was weak in the mind. He prayed more than he spoke. He was not feared. He was not loved. He was not ready. The death of Ivan Ivanovich sent waves through the palace, then across the land. The boyars began to plot again. The foreign ambassadors sent secret letters home. Poland smiled. Sweden sharpened its knives. And the people whispered in the streets. They whispered about the Tsar, about his madness, about the curse. They called it a curse, that God had turned his face from Russia, that the sins of the father had claimed the son, that the blood of saints would not wash out this time. In the cathedral, the priest read the final prayers. The bells rang low and long, but Ivan did not come. Instead, he sent guards, dozens of them. They surrounded the cathedral like a fortress. No one got close. No hands were allowed to touch the coffin, except those chosen by the Tsar. The dead boy was taken deep beneath the stone floors, into the vault where the rulers of Moscow slept. And there he lay, the last hope of a stable Russia. Gone, because his father could not hold back his rage. Gone, because power had turned love into fear. Outside the cathedral, snow began to fall again. Soft at first, then thick and endless. Moscow went quiet, and in the silence, everyone wondered the same thing. What now? Fyodor was never supposed to rule. He was the middle son, the quiet one, a figure who drifted through palace halls like a shadow. Courtiers barely noticed him. Servants bowed with more pity than respect. Even his own father, Ivan the Terrible, looked through him as if expecting someone else to stand there. But now, Fyodor was all that remained. He spent most of his time in prayer. He preferred churches to courts, icons to councils. The court called him pious, but behind their smiles, they whispered other things, weak, slow, touched by heaven, perhaps, but not fit for a crown. Still, a Tsar had to be named. The boyars gathered in low-ceilinged rooms. They spoke carefully, measured their words, watched each other's eyes. Ivan the Terrible was still alive, still dangerous, but the future was already cracking. Without a strong heir, Russia's throne was exposed like raw meat. Fyodor had one thing in his favor. He was harmless. He would not seize land. He would not start wars. He would not send men to the stake or slit throats at feasts. He would pray. He would nod. And the boyars believed they could rule through him. Ivan did not like it, but he accepted it. He had no choice. He crowned Fyodor as co-Tsar in a somber ceremony with more incense than applause. The crown sat too heavily on Fyodor's head. He flinched when it touched him, as if he feared it might burn. Ivan looked at his son with cold eyes. He gave no blessing, no fatherly hug. He simply turned away. Fyodor took the throne alone. His reign began not with parades, but with whispers. The nobles circled him like vultures. They offered guidance, then demanded loyalty. They flooded him with requests, gifts, and traps. And Fyodor smiled through it all. Not because he was wise, but because he did not know how to do anything else. He found comfort in the church, in the company of monks and bells. He wandered through cathedrals in the middle of the night, muttering prayers no one could understand. His advisors began handling the affairs of state entirely. Fyodor rarely argued. Often, he did not even listen. The people pitied him. The court mocked him, and behind palace walls, Ivan the Terrible watched his living son from afar, filled with regret that could never undo the blow he had struck on that terrible night. Russia had a Tsar, but it did not have a leader. It was a silent morning when they found the monk. Blood crusted his lips. His robes were torn, dragged across the cold flagstones of the bell tower. No one heard screams. No one saw a killer, but the message was loud. The church was no longer safe. Under Fyodor, monasteries had become sanctuaries of power. With the throne weak, boyars and clerics began shifting their alliances. Some whispered that the church would rule in all but name. Others feared the same fate that had swallowed Ivan Ivanovich. Russia did not forgive the weak, and it never waited for a vacuum to close itself. The dead monk had been one of Fyodor's few confidants. A quiet man with a bent spine and a voice like rusted hinges. He had advised the Tsar in prayer more than in policy, but he had influence, and now he was gone. Fyodor trembled when he heard the news. He had not spoken publicly in weeks, but now he demanded a council. Boyars gathered reluctantly, dragging their feet like children summoned after curfew. They expected the same soft-voiced monarch they could easily ignore. Instead, they found something else. Fyodor's eyes were swollen from tears, but his voice carried across the chamber like a cracked bell. He accused no one by name, but his gaze landed on every man there. He spoke of betrayal, of sin, of a curse that hung over the land like smoke. The room went still. Even the guard shifted uneasily. When he was done, Fyodor stood in silence, his fingers curled around the edge of the lectern. The boyars stared back, unsure whether to clap, pray, or leave. Then Fyodor did something none of them expected. He rang the bell himself. The same bell that had tolled for the monk's death now echoed across the palace at the hand of the Tsar. Its sound cut through the frost like a scream. In the village below, people fell to their knees. In the court above, men looked to each other in disbelief. Was this grief? Was this madness? Or was this power? Fyodor collapsed afterward, exhausted, his robes soaked with sweat. He did not attend court again for months, but the bell had changed something. The boyars grew cautious. They no longer laughed in his presence. The church, shaken, pulled back its ambitions. Yet danger had not passed. Blood once spilled was never forgotten in Moscow, and the bell would toll again. When whispers grow louder than orders, a kingdom begins to rot from within. That was the state of Russia in the cold months after the bell tower toll. Fyodor still breathed, still sat on the throne, but he ruled over silence and suspicion. And then came the pretender. No one knew exactly where he came from. Some claimed he was a runaway monk. Others believed he was a bastard of the royal bloodline, raised in secret and trained for this exact moment. What mattered was not the truth, but how quickly people believed the lie. He called himself Dmitri, a name already heavy with death and prophecy. The real Dmitri, Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, had died as a boy under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a seizure. Others whispered darker things. But now, 2 decades later, a grown man bearing the same name and claiming the same birthright emerged in Poland. He wore a beard too neat for a soldier, and armor too polished for war. But his words? They were fire. He promised reform. He promised vengeance. He promised the return of Ivan's strength without Ivan's terror. And Russia listened. Boyars, tired of Fyodor's frailty, began sending letters in secret. Merchants pledged supplies. Some generals, hungry for new wars and old power, quietly shifted their loyalty. Inside the Kremlin, Fyodor sat in the dark, clutching a crucifix. He had no son, no brother, no heir strong enough to defend the crown. The silence that had haunted his court for years was now broken by the sound of approaching hooves. The people remembered Ivan the Terrible with fear. But fear could be comforting. It was a kind of order. Under Fyodor, all they had was confusion. Who ruled? The church? The nobles? The foreign advisors? Dmitri's story gave them an answer. A face? A sword? The Tsar sent envoys to investigate. Most never returned. The few who did brought back terrifying reports. Armies were gathering. Cities were defecting. Villages already raised banners in the name of the dead boy reborn. Fyodor's health began to fail. He coughed blood onto royal parchment. He muttered to ghosts in the corners of his chambers. No one dared tell him the truth. The pretender was not coming. He was already inside the walls. The quiet years were over, and Moscow braced itself for a storm. Moscow held its breath. Fyodor, the son who never asked for power, was crumbling. The boyars circled like crows. The patriarch prayed louder than ever before. But prayer was no match for paranoia, and beneath the golden ceilings of the Kremlin, something older than fear lingered. The memory of Ivan the Terrible was not just in portraits or written edicts. It clung to the bricks, to the very bones beneath the throne. Ivan had not simply ruled. He had reshaped the soul of Russia. His violence had become part of the foundation, something the people had learned to live with. And now that vacuum yawned wide again. Fyodor was no match for the chaos his father had once caged with terror. By now, whispers of the pretender were everywhere. Some said he glowed with divine favor. Others said he could summon wolves with a gesture. All lies, of course. But lies, when repeated often enough, become a kind of truth. Fyodor's advisors begged him to strike, to name a successor, to crush the pretender before the boyars picked a new Tsar themselves. But Fyodor stalled. His body ached, his mind frayed. Each step he took through the palace left him breathless. He clutched icons to his chest and stared at the throne as if it would bite him. He had never wanted it, and now it was slipping from his fingers. The Kremlin began to split. Some courtiers remained loyal, clinging to a past that was clearly ending. Others made quiet deals with the winds. The guards still bowed, still wore the eagle on their chest, but they watched with blank eyes. Fyodor's wife, Irina, watched too. She saw the future in her husband's tremors. She heard it in the shifting footsteps outside their chambers at night. The dynasty was breaking, and all she could do was pray it did not swallow them whole. One winter morning, Fyodor failed to rise. No bell rang. No proclamation was made. Only the silence returned, the kind that wrapped the Kremlin like a shroud. In a locked room beneath the palace, scribes prepared scrolls for a funeral they dared not announce. Above them, in the throne room, the gilded chair stood empty. Dust floated in the still air, and somewhere deeper still, beneath the floor and buried in forgotten tunnels, were the bones of brothers, sons, and pretenders alike. Russia had outlived them all, but it had not forgotten. There was no cannon fire, no church bell, no mourning crowds in the streets. When Fyodor Ivanovich died, Moscow stayed quiet. It was not indifference, it was dread. The last legitimate son of Ivan the Terrible had died without an heir, and everyone knew what that meant. The Rurikid line, which had ruled Russia for centuries, was extinct, like the final echo of a church hymn fading into cold stone. At first, no one dared speak it aloud. The boyars met behind locked doors. The patriarch wept, but offered no answers. And Fyodor's body, wrapped in cloth embroidered with crosses, lay in state in a chamber so still it could have been a tomb. There was no plan for this. Ivan the Terrible had left chaos, and Fyodor had done nothing to clean it up. No sons, no daughters, just a crown too heavy, and a throne no man seemed worthy of sitting on. Russia froze, and then the bells stopped. No ringing for the dead Tsar, no call to prayer, just the wind pushing through the spires and alleys of the Kremlin. People whispered that it was a curse, that Ivan, wherever he was, had finally taken back his kingdom from the grave. Superstition bloomed. Women crossed themselves twice. Men hid icons in their coats. Peasants left offerings in the snow. Not for God, but for the dead. Some believed the pretender would save them. Others feared he was the one who killed the bells. The nobles began making moves. Each family wanted control. The Shuiskys, the Godunovs, the Romanovs, all old names with older grudges. Fyodor had kept them at peace only by existing. Now, with him gone, the masks slipped. One boyar was found poisoned. Another disappeared on his way to prayer. Bodies floated in the Moskva River, their identities never confirmed. And still, no one dared ring the bells. Irina, Fyodor's widow, was urged to seize power. She refused. She was no ruler. Her only request was that her husband be buried with dignity. They buried him at the Novodevichy convent, quietly, secretly, as if even his death could not be allowed to echo. The Russian people understood the silence, It was the sound of something ending. The Rurik dynasty was gone. What followed was not a new era. Not yet. It was a vacuum. A sucking, spiraling darkness that pulled every ambition and every lie into its center. And above it all, in the icy Moscow sky, the bells remained still. The silence didn't last. Into the vacuum left by Fyodor's death came voices. Loud ones. Desperate ones. And most dangerous of all, convincing ones. They came from every corner of the country. Some rode on horseback. Others marched with followers. All of them claimed the same thing, that they were the rightful ruler of Russia, that they carried royal blood, that God had chosen them, but most of all, they claimed to be the son Ivan had killed. Ivan Ivanovich, the boy with the shattered skull, brought back by divine mercy, and the people listened, because hope is seductive, and Russia was drowning in fear. The most famous was a man who came to be known as False Dmitri. He was clever, educated, charismatic. He had piercing eyes and a silver tongue, and he told a story so beautiful that it hurt to hear. According to him, Ivan Ivanovich had never died. He had been saved, hidden by loyalists, raised in secret, and now he had returned to take his throne. The crowd swallowed every word. And why wouldn't they? He looked like a czar. He acted like a czar. He promised bread and order and glory. Most importantly, he promised an end to the suffering. So they followed him, town by town, village by village, until he reached Moscow and sat on the throne his father had once called sacred. But not everyone believed. The boyars, bitter and watchful, saw through him. The church squirmed, and Boris Godunov, now Tsar in name, saw only a threat that needed to be crushed. What followed was not just a civil war. It was a deluge. The time of troubles began, a period so chaotic and brutal that it would become legend. Famine swept through the land. Polish armies invaded from the west. Swedish mercenaries burned their way from the north. Entire cities were emptied. Villages eaten by fire. Mothers drowned their own children to spare them starvation. And in the middle of it all were the pretenders. Some were killed, some disappeared. Others ruled briefly before being torn to pieces by mobs. There were so many claimants that people stopped remembering their names. Each one a reminder that the real Ivan Ivanovich was dead, and no crown would ever fit the same way again. The dynasty had ended with a blow to the head, and in trying to bring it back, Russia nearly destroyed itself. The bells had stopped for Fyodor. Now the cities burned for his brother. For all the tears shed, for all the churches filled with smoke and incense, for all the false suns and shattered cities, there was one thing that never turned up: the body. Ivan Ivanovich's corpse was never buried in public. No grand funeral, no procession of grieving nobles, no shrine where peasants could weep and pray. Just silence. Historians will tell you that Ivan the Terrible killed his son with a blow to the head. A heavy staff, a flash of rage, a moment he could never take back. Some say the prince died that same day. Others say he lingered in agony for days while his father cried at his bedside. But where is he? Why was the body hidden? Some believe Ivan was so ashamed that he refused to give his son a proper burial. Others suggest he feared the public reaction. Or maybe, in one of the darker rumors, the corpse was too gruesome to show. The skull too caved in, the body too broken. Still, there were whispers that the boy had survived and was being hidden away, that his bones were buried in a secret tomb beneath a monastery, that they had been tossed into the Volga River to wash away the shame. Centuries passed, and yet no one could confirm anything. In the Soviet era, when the Romanov tombs were opened and the remains of emperors were studied, hopes were briefly raised. Perhaps here, among the bones, would be a clue, something to finally close the chapter, a fragment of the poisoned crown. But there was nothing, and so the legends grew. Maybe Ivan Ivanovich had been smuggled to a monastery and lived out his days in quiet suffering, blind and broken. Maybe he had been poisoned later in a final act of mercy or politics. Maybe he had never existed at all. Ridiculous, but not impossible, because the thing about Russia, the thing about pain, is that the truth often gets swallowed. The winters are long, the roads muddy, the bodies disappear, and the people forget not because they want to, but because forgetting is safer than knowing. To this day, somewhere in the Russian soil, the son of Ivan the Terrible lies without a name carved in stone. No monument, no memory, just a crown passed on to a boy who could never wear it, and a silence that still screams under the earth. Ivan the Terrible wore many titles: Tsar, warrior, father, murderer, but one title clung to him like rot: legacy maker. Not because he forged greatness, not because he built something lasting, but because the legacy he left behind was one of ruin. When he struck his own son dead in that fateful moment of fury, he did not just end a life, he ended a future. Russia's heir was gone, and the boy who followed, the gentle, sickly Fyodor, was never meant for the throne. A ruler in name only. The real reins were gripped by others: boyars, regents, scheming clerics, and then chaos. With Fyodor's death came the time of troubles, a decade of impostors, famines, civil wars, of foreign armies marching on Moscow, of false sons rising from the grave to claim they were the murdered Ivan Ivanovich. A poisoned crown indeed. The crown, meant to symbolize divine authority and power, instead became an omen. Whoever wore it bled. Whoever reached for it died. And all of it could be traced to one man's fury, one father's unrelenting paranoia, one blow that cracked more than a skull. It cracked the nation. Even centuries later, the ghost of Ivan's legacy lingered in the Russian court. The idea that power came through fear, that ruling meant domination, that a son could be a rival, that love was a weakness. No ruler could wear the crown without hearing whispers of the one who destroyed his own child. Ivan the Terrible never apologized. Some say he wept at his son's deathbed. Some say he built churches to beg forgiveness from God. But what he never did was undo it. What he never could do was bring his son back. The weight of the crown did not lift after that. It only grew heavier, more cursed. By the time the Romanovs rose, the dynasty was so desperate for stability, they built palaces out of silence, out of rewritten truths, out of buried corpses and forgotten names. But the shadow of Ivan remained. It always would. Because when a father kills a son for a throne, the throne is never clean again. Not for a generation, not for a dynasty, not for an empire, and not for history. The story of Ivan Ivanovich is not just about a single act of violence. You want more stories like this? Like this video and subscribe to our channel. There's one more coming up on your screen right now. Let's get into it.